Good evening, and thanks for joining tonight's TI Technology webinar hosted by Texas Instruments, where tonight we're going to take a look at some formative assessment strategies. I see that many of you are joining us for the first time, so we'd like to offer a special welcome if this is your first TQ'd Professional Development webinar. We also like to thank everyone for completing the live survey on the right side of your screen. My name is Mike Houston, and I'm the moderator for this event. I teach algebra and calculus near Pittsburgh, where I use TI technology to make tough-to-teach, tough-to-learn concepts accessible to all my students. I'm really excited to introduce our two panelists tonight, Kyle Atkin and Katie Martinez. Kyle is currently the mathematics resource teacher for the Kern High School District in Bakersfield, California. He organizes professional development and coordinates the mathematics programs for 18 comprehensive high schools and 5 continuation high schools. Before that, he spent 13 years in the classroom using TI technology to enhance student learning in algebra and AP statistics, as well as other math courses. Thanks for being with us, Kyle.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
And Katie has taught high school math for the past 13 years. Technology has enabled her students to make connections across the curriculum and to make and test conjectures. Thanks for being with us, Katie.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here too.
We're expecting a large crowd, so your audio is automatically muted. Feel free to send questions to Katie or Kyle using the Q&A window on the right section of your screen. We'll also be using the chat window to send general messages. Once we begin sharing our desktop and showing that software, that right section of your screen, the chat window and the Q&A window is going to be replaced with a green floating toolbar. And you can access the Q&A window by clicking the question icon. This session is being recorded, and as a reminder, you'll receive a link for the event certificate of attendance at the conclusion of the webinar. Once that recording is available, if you'd like to follow along, that'd be great. It might be easier to do so with that recording. That way you can go at your own pace. We hope you don't have any audio issues tonight, but if you do, try selecting Communicate in the WebEx menu, choose Audio Broadcast, and then click Join. At this point, Katie is going to discuss our agenda.
We're going to be focusing on the definition of formative assessment, or what we think the definition of formative assessment is. We'll be talking about how to get students engaged in that formative assessment process, how to collect responses, how to write questions or features of questions that we think should be good questions to ask, or what we need to get out of the students in order to make our formative assessment process successful. So we're excited to be getting rolling here.
Thanks, Katie. And Kyle is going to discuss our expected outcomes.
So hopefully at the end of this webinar, we'll talk a little bit about, you'll have an understanding at least of what it takes perhaps to grow a leadership culture that can promote teacher learning, that can promote the idea of how to bring formative assessment ideas into your practice at your particular site or your particular district. We're also going to do some exploring on how TI technology can assist in that, how it can support and facilitate effective formative assessment practices. And then we're also going to talk about questioning strategies, what it means to have a good question and a good formative assessment question so that we can gain insight into our students' thinking.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Katie, you are the presenter. It's all yours.
Perfect. So before we get into what we feel might be the definition of formative assessment, we want to get your feedback. So in the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen, if you could type in what you feel formative assessment is. What is your definition of formative assessment? So in your chat window, if you could type in again what your definition of formative assessment is. We want to see what you think before we start the presentation.
Yeah, Katie, there tends to be kind of a lot of different definitions for it. So I'm interested to see how that ranges across the country.
Me too, because I know in my district, in my school, there's a lot of different opinions, and none of them are wrong. They're all great opinions. They're all great definitions. So it's important to see and to have some sort of common talking place, I think.
I see Sherry mentioning on the fly during a lesson, so definitely fits the bill there.
And I see that Hope said that it's any type of assessment that lets her see where her students are at a given time. And Rebecca said assessments that allow her to make a decision on how to direct the next step in her instruction.
Yeah, Jeffrey's talking about the idea of mistakes and understanding and changing your lecture and changing your practices to fill in the mistakes students are making. That's a huge part of it as well.
I agree. And Linda just said it's ongoing testing or ongoing questioning to see what's sticking and what isn't. So, you know, maybe how can we support the student in their understanding. So I'm going to share our PowerPoint here. And just a reminder that you probably want to scroll your little arrow up to the top, maybe bring down that chat window, because we will probably ask you some questions throughout our little presentation here, try and get some feedback from you, or if you have questions, you can certainly put them in the Q&A or in the chat window so that we can get your feedback. So if you scroll to the top, you'll be able to pull down that floating toolbar. So the question again was, what was formative assessment? You all had lots of great responses. One of the things that we want to really focus on is it's intentional questions to see what students know or don't know. Intentional is the key word there. We really need to think about what we're going to ask. We need to think about what we need to get information about. So it's intentional questions. It's based upon content or knowledge that's necessary to move on in a lesson. Sometimes it's within the class period. Sometimes it's minute to minute within that class period. It's content or knowledge that might even be necessary to move from one class period into the next day's lesson, or content knowledge to move from one chapter to the next chapter. But it's based upon that content or knowledge that's necessary for students' understanding to grow. It's a basis for adjusting our instruction. So how are we going to change our instruction? That's one of the things we'll be talking about tonight a little bit, is how do you change your instruction based upon the results you get? How do you support students, or how do you remediate and really help those students that might be struggling? And with those common misconceptions, we really need to focus in our attention so that we can support those students so they can grow in their learning.
That's really, Katie, one of the biggest, the most difficult parts, I think, of the formative assessment process is what are you going to do with your instruction based on the feedback you're getting from students. So that's definitely a big one that we want to talk about.
I agree, and I think it's an ongoing conversation that we will have within our professional learning communities, within even Twitter or Facebook groups, email groups, all blogs. Those different conversations are important for helping us to grow as teachers and help our students to learn. Formative assessment could be formal or it could be informal. I definitely believe it needs to be planned in some way or another. Maybe you collect the data and you keep it and you monitor the growth of students on a certain standard over the course of the year. Or maybe you just ask a question on the fly and it's a pre-planned question, but maybe you didn't plan on having students submit answers or write down answers formally. And so, but you're still collecting responses and making judgments and altering your instruction if need be. There's a couple keys to formative assessment. The first is, what do we want to identify? What's most important for our lesson to continue? What's most important for our students to continue to learn from mistakes that they may be making? So what is it that we really need to identify? What are those concepts or those skills that we need to really look at clearly? We need to talk about, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit, is how do we collect results? Are we going to use technology? Are we going to do this a little bit more, less formally? How are we going to collect those results? What kinds of questions do we ask to get the answers that we need? We need to look at the common misconceptions and think about what those common misconceptions are and create our questions surrounding those. So what are the important questions in our lessons that are going to help us make decisions? And then finally, when we have the data, after we've asked the questions to the students and collected all that data, what do we do with it? And like you said, Kyle, that's key to our instruction. That's key to students learning and altering their misconceptions and helping them to grow as students. So what do we do with that data once it's collected?
Yeah, so you talked, Katie, about the idea of, what do we want to identify? And we mentioned a lot about the fact that it needs to be planned. And so with formative assessment, we're really talking about, to do it really well, you really need it to be planned as opposed to unplanned. And what I mean by that is unplanned is just going about and kind of noticing what you notice throughout a lesson. That's kind of unplanned. To an extent, the more experience you have teaching, the better you get at the unplanned type of formative assessment. It's the planned formative assessment that can be difficult. But what we know is that the better we get at planned formative assessment, the better we get at the unplanned formative assessment as well. The better we are at noticing, where students are at and what they're thinking and how they're thinking. When we're talking about planned formative assessment, we really are speaking of this idea of data-driven decision-making versus decision-driven data collection. So there's kind of a movement now to talk about, when it comes to formative assessment, to talk about decision-driven data collection as opposed to data-driven decision-making. For a long time, we've been hearing, data-driven decision-making. And what that really implies is that the data comes first, and then we figure out kind of what direction we need to go based on the data. But that's more in line with kind of a summative type of idea. When we talk about decision-driven data collection, that's really understanding and knowing what you want to collect data on. What do you want to know from your students, and how are you going to get that information? So kind of that first idea of what do we want to identify is very important. We need to be specific and really look at lessons and figure out kind of where in this lesson do we need to be, and what kind of data do we need to collect in order to make the decisions that we need to make within the lesson. So we really need to be focusing on data-driven decision-making as opposed to, the data-driven decision-making. That comes along with it. But we want to focus on the idea of collecting the data in a way that will give us the information that we need to make the decisions we want. When we talk about asking questions, I see Kathy put in the comments that she's hearing Dylan Williams. There's a lot of Dylan Williams with formative assessments. He's one of the big gurus there, so I appreciate that comment. He talks about hinge questions. So when we talk about when to ask questions within a lesson, this idea of at what point in the lesson are we going to collect evidence of student understanding so that we can make a decision on where we need to go in the next part of the lesson. This idea of the whole entire lesson hinging on that particular point in the lesson, that's when we need to ask and develop a good question. That's when we need to figure out what we want to ask and how we want to collect that data. And
and Kyle, sorry to interrupt. I think sometimes that hinge point is at the very start of a lesson when we're doing an opener or a warm-up or a bell ringer, as some people call it. Oftentimes that warm-up could be the decision maker for our lesson.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Whatever we need to know that the remainder of the lesson, we can't go anywhere unless we know what the students are thinking. That's when it's a good time to ask a question. And that could happen once during the lesson. It could happen 3 or 4 times. It could happen every 6 to 10 minutes during a lesson. So it's a very important thing to think about. And it goes right along with the idea of it being planned. So like you said, Katie, it could happen at the beginning, partway through, multiple times throughout, but that's the key is we need to know in our lesson when the decision point that we need to make in order to move forward with that lesson.
And I think I saw Mark put something a minute ago that these questions that we're asking are very important distinctions that have to be practiced over time. I think, as you said earlier, the more that we practice this planned questioning and making decisions before we even start a lesson or before we even go further in our lesson is so key. And we get better at it with time. It takes practice, and it takes that bravery and that pulling ourselves out of the box and out of that safety zone as teachers, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of developing good questions, we also kind of have to go back and forth with this idea of a discussion questions versus diagnostic. We talk about discussion questions. Those aren't necessarily very good at eliciting evidence and feedback from students. One of the reasons for that is you need to get feedback from all your students. You need to know where all your students are at. And those discussion questions really take a long time to kind of go around the room in terms of discussion. So they're not as good at eliciting evidence. One of the other reasons is it's hard to remember as a teacher what everybody says, you know, and record all that down in a manner that you can use to make decisions with. So the idea of diagnostic questions, those are better types of questions to use, and even multiple choice. Multiple choice can get a bad rap sometimes, but multiple choice questions can be very well designed, especially for this idea of formative assessment. So those diagnostic questions, very short, sweet, get to the point type of questions. Those are the kind of questions that we're looking for with formative assessment. Also, identifying relevant misconceptions. That's almost kind of the starting place that we want to look at when we're developing good questions. Questions need to be designed so that students with the correct thinking don't get the same answers as those with incorrect thinking. And so that's really a starting place for most good questions, is what are the misconceptions that are out there? We want to take a little bit of time right now and let you kind of give some feedback here in terms of misconceptions. So in the chat window that you've been commenting with, what misconceptions do you notice in your students' mathematical understanding for whatever subject or whatever grade level that you're teaching? If you could jot those into the chat window, we can kind of collect those and kind of see what everybody's misconceptions are.
Jeffrey just said exponents, meaning the exponent times the base is the answer. So the understanding of exponent, what does it mean to have an exponent? Cynthia just said confusing rate of change and the constant of proportionality. Lots of answers coming through here. Marilyn just said when they can factor, often trying to, quote, factor part of the algebraic sum. And Kathy just said in 7th grade, some of hers are still having trouble converting percents. Ooh, I lost that. I'm sorry. I believe it said percents and decimals.
Yeah.
Percents and decimals to fractions.
So as we're looking at a lot of these misconceptions, these are things we need to consider and take into account as we're looking at creating good questions. We want to make sure that the questions that we develop will be sure to identify the misconceptions that students have, because that's what we need to know as teachers. That's what formative assessment is all about, identifying the misconceptions of students' understanding so that we can correct that before any final assessment is given, before we get that summative part.
And even identifying the misconceptions before we even start those lessons. Sometimes we start a lesson and we have to backtrack because there was a misconception in it. And so we want to be able to have smoother lessons. We want students to be able to think for themselves and not get bogged down on some of the small details. So if we can nail those misconceptions beforehand, we'll make for smoother transition there.
Yeah, and these are things that really you notice happening, every year pretty much, that students really struggle with every year. Well, there's some good comments in that chat section that we're saying here. So that's really a good starting place to have is those misconceptions. Once we kind of establish those misconceptions, then we can really kind of look to develop the question. But we want to develop it with distractors. We want to make sure that those misconceptions that we identify, those are the distractors that we want to make sure we have in our questions. So this is really kind of one of the key strategies is making sure that you can identify the misconceptions with the distractors that you have in the questions that you're developing. And then one of the last things about developing good questions that really the teachers that I work with kind of have a hard time understanding. As teachers, we want to make sure things kind of happen very quickly and can fix the things that happen in our classroom. But one of the things we need to understand with formative assessment, and especially with questions, is that whenever we give them, we're really testing the question. We're really testing the question with students. The point here is really that anytime we develop a good question, it's going to have to be revised for any lessons in the future. And it's not necessarily going to be perfect the first time. And so as we develop formative assessments for certain lessons, it's really a test. And we want to make sure that we always go back to it and ask ourselves, did I get the information that I was looking for from the question? And if not, how do I need to change that? What do I need to change in the lesson? It's always a test. It's an ongoing process, this whole idea of formative assessment. And even the questions that we develop, whether they're questions, those hinge point questions that we talked about earlier or not, they're always going to need to be revised a little bit to make sure that they're giving the information that we want them to give.
And I think along with that line is developing good questions is not a solo activity. I think it's important to have your teachers within your subjects or your teachers within a bigger community help you out in coming up with some of those good questions. So talking with your colleagues about, here's my concept I need to teach today, and what kind of questions can I ask? Or here's my question that I want to ask. What do you think? And how would you respond to this question, or how would your students respond to that question? And bringing in a broader audience beyond just students and getting teachers involved, I think is really important idea there in developing those good questions.
Absolutely. And the TI-Nspire Teacher Edition software helps facilitate some of this too. You want to talk about some of the good questions that we can develop using that software, Katie?
Yeah, I'd love to. And we're using the word good in quotes here. I mean, obviously, there's lots of great questions out there, and there's, we can always revise them and make them better. But here's a few options for types of good questions that might get the formative assessment responses you're hoping for to help you guide your instruction, to help your students to grow as learners. The first one's multiple choice with one correct answer. As Kyle mentioned earlier, the distractors are so important. Looking for those misconceptions and putting those misconceptions in as distractors will help you to see who really understands the problem or who's understanding it incorrectly, and that way you know exactly what their misconception is. And misconceptions, because we have multiple choice, we typically think A through D responses or A through E responses. You could potentially have 10 different wrong answers and one correct answer. So not just narrowing down your multiple choice to 4 or 5 responses, but allowing for a broader range of responses. That way you can pinpoint what their misconceptions were on the formative assessment question.
That's a great point, Katie, too, because a lot of times we're ingrained with 4 possible choices or 5 possible choices because of our state assessments and things like that. So it's just kind of what we see most often, and so that's kind of what we go to. So that's a great point that they can certainly have multiple distractors in them.
Yeah, and Janine just said, I think multiple choice questions are so important. It's preparing them for college, CBEST, CSETs, SATs, etc., different state tests, things like that. Definitely, and I think having them think and talk about the results that we get with Inspire Navigator, we can quickly see the results, and we can talk about the answers without even telling them which one's correct. And so a student who may have given the wrong answer could actually support their reasoning, and that gives the students a good discussion base and could give some debates in the class as to why that might be right or why that answer might be wrong. So that was a really great point there, Janine. So questions, another type of good question is questions with multiple correct answers. This allows us to see what students are thinking, allows us to see who's on the right track, but also allows us to have some more discussion about those correct answers, and doesn't necessarily narrow it down to you're just right or you're just wrong, but it gives us a little bit more flexibility. And then explanation questions, Kyle, you said earlier that sometimes they're hard to work with. But if we phrase them correctly and we really think about how we want to word the question to get the intended results, explanation questions can really be a nice guiding into our lesson and allow us to have those discussion points and those jumping off points that we need to have good discussions and to engage the students.
Oh yeah, and definitely the TI-Nspire software can facilitate those explanation questions very nicely too. So.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm going to show everyone some sample questions. Of course, this is not the be-all and end-all. But here's one multiple choice question with one correct answer. You can see that the students have a graph on the right-hand side of the screen, and it's asking them which of the following could represent the slope of the graph of the red line if the dashed line has a slope of 1. And so hopefully the students aren't going to put -2 or 0. Those are common distractors. Seeing the -2 would obviously let us see who understands a positive direction versus a negative direction, rise and run, that sort of thing. A 0 slope would allow us to see if students understand what a 0 slope means in relationship to that line. And so hopefully they're able to narrow it down to a 1/2 or 7/3, and therefore seeing, do they understand the meaning of slope? Do they understand rate of change in this way? And they could certainly count on the graph, and there's nothing wrong with that. At least they have some sort of method to get that slope.
Yeah, there's some chat going on too in terms of multiple choice questions that I've seen a lot of teachers use, and so I thank Peter for bringing that up. The idea that when you have good multiple choice questions too, it's always a good idea to have students explain why they didn't choose some of the other answers. That goes a long way in helping to identify misconceptions that students have even from year to year. So one of a great strategy to do with formative assessments is to have students not only select the right answers, but to identify why they didn't choose the other distractors as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you show the responses with Inspire Navigator, you get a histogram, and so you're able to see, or a bar graph, and you're able to see very quickly who gave which responses. So if you have half your class giving the first response there of 1/2, and the other half giving 7/3 as the response, what a debate you can start having, and what a discussion you can start having, and can we get some methods for identifying the slope, and can we get some methods for seeing how this rate of change is affecting the graph of the line. So some really great explanations that we can get along with those, and I think, Peter, you're on the right track with your comments there. Another option for a multiple choice question, this is just a simple subtraction. I teach high school math, and even for sophomores, I sometimes see these mistakes being made. If this was a hinge point in my class, if I can't go any further without them understanding some simple subtraction, this obviously might be a more elementary sort of level, but it's important for us to know who's understanding and who's not, and let's make some judgments and some educational responses and calls about our lesson based upon these responses. And here's an example of a multiple choice question with multiple correct answers. So on Inspire Navigator, we can have students physically drop points onto the graph I provided an equation there. They can go and they can drop the solutions, and hopefully my students will understand that those solutions are the x-intercepts. But it is also possible that students are going to drop them on the y-intercept, or they might drop them on the local maximum or the local minimum. And so by having that visual representation of dropping the points, it allows me as a teacher to quickly gauge who understands and who doesn't. There are multiple correct answers to this question. I've set it up so that my students can actually put in all 3 answers. They can drop 3 different points. I could have had them drop 5 different points, but only 3 of them are correct. So that's an option as well, and it allows me to see who's on the right track and who needs more support very quickly just by seeing where the points land on the graph.
I'm really glad, Katie, that you mentioned the whole visual aspect of that, because this really is a question that where you see on the Nspire software, you really get a good visual of where exactly the students are dropping those points. So it's a very quick way of seeing, man, are my kids understanding, or where are all the points kind of congregating? And so I'm very glad you said that, because that's one of the things about formative assessment and good questions. It doesn't always have to be something that you have to grade. It could be something that you can just get a real quick look at.
Yeah, I agree. And Sherry just asked a question, how do they actually drop the points? They can use the touchpad on their handheld to move the cursor around, and then they just click where their cursor is located. When they're happy with where it's located, they click, and it'll set the points down. So it's kind of like a mouse on a computer screen. They can physically move their cursor around and then click on the screen on their handheld, and it'll drop a point right there and there. And as a teacher perspective, it allows me to see both the coordinate points but also the visual. I can actually see physically on the graph where they've dropped it, so I can overlay this graph on top of all those points and see them all hopefully landing in the same spot. This is Nspire Navigator, so you can put these questions into any Nspire document. You don't have to have Navigator, but a Navigator allows me to analyze those results very quickly. The next one, again, another multiple correct answers, another graph. This one's got an image behind it. I did not take this image. This came preloaded on my handheld. But the students this time can graph a line that's parallel to the one on the screen. Now, this might have a messy looking slope, but the nice feature here is that students can play around with their equation and see it graphed on the screen along with what you're seeing here. And then they can alter their equation. They can change their slope or their y-intercept to try to get one that matches. And we could have many, many different answers here. Again, very visual from a teacher perspective, as I can see quickly which of my students' lines are not going to be matching up with that one and not parallel. So very quickly I can click on a line that might be on the screen and see, oh, Johnny Doe needs a little bit more help, or Sally Smith needs a little bit more help, and go think about how am I going to help that student, or how do I need to help the whole class potentially.
And this is one of the questions too that it really can go a lot of different ways. I mean, is your goal that they understand what parallel lines are? Because you can certainly get that from this particular type of questions very visually and looking at it very quickly. Or is it, can they write an equation of a line that's parallel to another line? So just depends upon what it is you want to know from the student. So this question can serve multiple purposes depending upon what it is and what we've identified we want to know from students.
Definitely. And we talk about formative assessment within a class period. Again, it could be between lessons, it could be between chapters. We could be doing some formative assessment before they take a summative assessment. So there's lots of different ways of assessing students and different times that are appropriate. And so how you use a question or what you're going to do with those results might change based upon the answers you get. The next one I'm showing is just a geometry example. So here the students would actually put in ordered pairs as answers. And so as a teacher, I can see all those ordered pairs. I could potentially graph them. I have got a triangle here, and the students are asked if you translate the triangle up 3 units and 2 units to the left to identify coordinates of just 1 point that would be on the image triangle. Obviously, there's infinitely many points possible. My students are probably like most students in that they use the vertices to do the translation, although potentially they could use the y-intercept on that graph to translate. And so that becomes another point where I have lots of correct answers, and all of those correct answers are showing their conceptual understanding to guide me through my lesson. And one of the nice features of Nspire Navigator is that with all those collected responses, the software itself will grade all of them, and I can mark as many correct as I need, and I can store those and save those responses, or I can just keep going with my lesson or change how I need to. Then we get on to explanation questions. Explanation questions can obviously be more time-consuming. We're asking students to type in answers or write down answers, whatever method we're using to collect, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And sometimes they're hard to judge if the student truly understands the concept. So with explanation questions, we need to make sure we're phrasing the question the way that we want to get results, or so that we get intended results. This type of question would allow the teacher to see the thought process being used to find the midpoint. I use this question in my class, and I actually had lots of different responses given. Some students drew a rectangle using those 2 points, and so drew horizontal and vertical lines to create their rectangle and found the midpoint using the diagonals. Some students counted, some students used slopes. Some students drew little diagrams on their papers, and so if they were drawing something, obviously they wouldn't be able to type it in, but if I'm collecting it by paper, there's nothing wrong with diagrams being drawn. I think someone's asking about, I'm talking about Nspire Navigator for collecting at this point, but you could certainly collect responses, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in multiple different ways.
Yeah, so Katie, someone asked about how do they get in more information about this Nspire Navigator, and so
I saw something like that come up.
Yeah, so I mean the TI-Nspire software, all these questions are created with using the TI-Nspire Teacher Edition software. Being able to send these questions out to students and to be able to collect them very, very quickly. You can assess, you can send homework, you can send classwork, you can send these documents filled with these types of questions. All of that's possible with the TI-Nspire Navigator system as well. So we can talk more about that a little bit later on, I think, in the webinar.
Yeah. I'll just go past this one. So we're talking about methods for collecting responses. These are a few methods that I've used. Nspire Navigator, like Kyle just said, allows me to quickly send out responses. Some of the others are ABCD cards. I have students sometimes hold up cards with letters. In that case, I'm limited to 4 cards, but I can certainly go more. Or holding up fingers or thumbs up, thumbs down. Listening to conversations would be a very informal way, and I may not get everyone's response. One of the things I want to ask you all is, are there methods that I don't have listed here, or methods that you rely on heavily for collecting responses? What are those methods that you're using in your own classes for collecting student responses to formative assessment questions? Leslie just said exit tickets. Ooh, clickers. I'm not sure what clickers are. Dry erase boards. I love dry erase boards because that allows me to personally see student work, because sometimes it allows me to see the thought process. A Kahoot.
Someone commented about being able to have a student explain what someone else had said. So kind of putting a student on the hot seat and asking them to, make sense of somebody else's explanation, if you will.
That sounds challenging. I love it. I think when you can re-explain someone else's thought process, you understand it better. And if it's a misconception that you're re-explaining, it allows the student to explain it in a new way so that someone else may not get it wrong anymore.
Yeah, one of the methods that I've seen some people use, and kind of a strategy, if you will, that I've heard recently is to have a no hands up policy, unless you're actually going to ask a question. But in other words, if you know the answer to a question, you can't put your hand up. You have to wait until the teacher calls on you. That way you get away from the ooh, 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 and the me type of students who are always answering questions. And so the no hands up kind of policy, unless you're going to ask a question, has kind of negated some of that and allowed other students some more think time and some time to comprehend and be a part of the lesson as well.
I love that idea, and I think what you just said about think time is so critical to collecting responses. Is we know that our students work at different paces, and giving them all an opportunity to respond in one way or another, giving everyone an opportunity to think about what the question's asking and maybe approach it in different ways. If the first person has their hand up, that might discourage other people from answering. Even if that person might be wrong, but having everyone give that wait time and allow them to use different processes, because some people need to draw diagrams, or they need to graph something, or they need to write it out and really think about what the question's asking in order to get a response. One of the things I use Navigator, and one of the things I love about Navigator, is it allows me to get a response from everybody. My most shy student, and actually I've got several students that just moved here from out of the country, from China and Japan, and it allows them to have a say and allows them to communicate in one way or another. Their answers may not be grammatically correct, but when I have multiple choice questions, it allows me to really see what they're thinking and get their answers. And they may not want to share that verbally with the whole class, and so they may not be that first student to raise their hand. And Stacy just said something so important, that Navigator allows us to document what they're saying, document what they said or didn't say. I love the fact that you put in there that what they didn't say. It allows me to save the responses so that when I'm in my professional learning community, we're talking about our formative assessment process and we're talking about student understandings and misunderstandings. Which of my students understood the question? What were those misconceptions that they got wrong? How can we improve our teaching and their learning? So using those results so that we can save them allows me to go back to them later and really think about what went wrong, what went right, and how can I support my students.
Sherry commented, oh, sorry,
yeah.
Katie.
No, please do.
Sherry commented, putting names of students on popsicle sticks and pulling them from a cup, and then asking questions, and then calling the name of the student. So it allows them to pay attention. That's a good point of a strategy to help make sure that they're paying attention first. I've also heard of, instead of names on the cup, depending upon if you teach multiple classes, you might just want to put, number the desks and have the numbers on the cup, and then you only have to have one set of sticks. So that's something else that can be considered.
And Susan just said use a random number generator as a calculator, match the student desk numbers. Another nice way. I really like that idea of calling the student out, asking or saying their name first and giving the question so they're aware of what's going on. They haven't accidentally tuned me out. But seeing, whatever method we're using, it's important to see everybody's response, to have everyone have a voice, because everyone's important in getting them to learn. We want everyone to succeed. We probably aren't in this job to have people fail. We want everyone to succeed. And so by giving feedback to our students, that is going to allow those students to flourish and to grow as learners. So now that we've collected responses in whatever method that we're using, I want to ask you all the questions. What do you do with those results? This is formative assessment. So what do we do with results to these responses? So in the chat window, if you could answer that question, what do you do with the results to your different formative assessment questions?
That's really the key to the formative assessment process is, once you have the data, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, I'm seeing some people saying going over misconceptions that they found. Some people are using it to modify their teaching either today or in future lessons. Ooh, flexible regrouping. I love that idea. Having students even regroup themselves based upon their answers. Janine just said if someone flat out fails one of her 4-point quizzes, she reteaches the topic, otherwise she moves on. Group the students. Melissa's saying she uses it to group the students into smaller learning groups. Talk about individualizing instruction there. I love that.
The theme that I see coming up on all these chat comments are really giving students feedback and letting them, giving them the feedback of the misconceptions. A lot of people have said misconceptions, giving them the feedback of where they're going wrong and how they need to fix their mistakes in the future. And so mistakes are huge. Getting them to understand that idea of growth mindset, that it's okay to make mistakes. It's key to establishing that culture in your class in order to create a good formative assessment process within and culture within your class.
I completely agree. And so some of the things that I was seeing come out of your chat are some of these things that we've written down here. It's reteaching the lesson, maybe continuing on with the lesson or regrouping students, providing differentiated worksheets or lessons, still giving students scaffolding where they might need it or taking off some of those scaffolds, but getting them to the same end result. And Kyle, what you were just saying, specific feedback to the students. Students need that feedback, and if it's possible, when it's possible, give students individual feedback, because how student A responds to a certain feedback could be very different than another student. So really knowing your students and making them feel as though their feedback is important to their own learning. And so knowing your students and being able to gauge your feedback to that individual will really help them kind of buy in more to this whole formative assessment process. And I think that feedback and these next steps of what we do all have to be pre-planned. I certainly can't reteach a lesson if I haven't thought about it. I can't regroup students if I haven't thought about it. So maybe I use those distractors in a multiple choice question, and everyone who gave the wrong answer of A gets grouped together, and now they're given some sort of feedback on their response, or they're given a problem that might be a step down from the problem that they were originally given. And everyone who gave distractor B, maybe they're given an extension problem or a challenge problem, and because they got the answer right. And then everyone who gave answer C, the distractor C, maybe they get a little bit more scaffolding that's needed in order to get them to the result.
So I'm saying, that she also uses student responses for error analysis to look at the errors that students are making and to analyze, why they're making it. And that you have to develop that culture of trust within that classroom. One of the things about that in TI-Nspire Navigator system is that it does that anonymously. It allows you to look at the responses of students anonymously. And so that's really good when you're trying to look at student errors that they're making and have it be real time in real life. The fact that it's anonymous makes that culture of trust and that culture of growth mindset a little bit easier to create in your classroom.
Right, I agree. And I think having students be willing to discuss different answer choices, whether they're right or wrong, allows students to see different perspectives and to understand student thinking, as long as we obviously guide them in the correct direction. And so we've got a couple scenarios here. We want to see how would you respond to these scenarios. So my first one was, what would you do if almost all your students got your formative assessment question right? If almost everyone correctly answered that formative assessment question, what would you do? Maybe it's the start of your lesson, maybe it's in the middle of your lesson. Celebrate it. I love that. Have a dance party. Go on with your lesson. Praise them, definitely. So if they got it right, maybe it's not worth the time of going over it. Maybe it's not, if this is a warm-up or an opener, and you've assessed whether they know the point of your lesson, and they know the content of your lesson, why go on with it? Maybe have a new lesson plan. Marilyn just said dig deeper into the concept. Great idea. Let's challenge them. Let's give them some other questions to make them think outside the box or to apply their knowledge. Linda just said ask extensions of it and look for alternate solutions. Alternate solutions are so important in math. So giving a different response and how are we getting to that answer in a new way. So here's another one. What would you do if half of your students correctly answered your assessment question? So maybe this is a multiple choice question where half the students got one distractor wrong and half the students got the correct answer. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I was going to say, Jeannie talked about share paired, you know, to pair up students that one from each side and have them talk about the reasons why they chose the answers that they chose. That's a great idea.
And Leslie, excuse me, just said to ask one person answer the question right, answered the question both right and working. So maybe have someone explain why the other side got a different answer. Sherry just said give them 2 minutes to find someone with a different answer and discuss it, then reassess it. I think that reassessing, Sherry, I think you just hit that on the nail. We need to make sure that our assessment process is fluid, that we're doing it multiple times, that we're not just glazing over it, assessing once and moving on. We need to keep assessing our students. And it doesn't have to be worth points. It doesn't have to go in the grade book. Perhaps it's just something that we ask again or we ask in a new way. But I think making sure that we reassess is so critical to the success of our students.
And Jeffrey asked a kind of a good point. If it's anonymous, how are we going to know? That's the one nice thing about, one of the nice things about the Inspire Navigator system is it's anonymous to students, but it's not anonymous to the teacher. The teacher has the ability to know who's answering what question.
Yes.
That's a great question, Jeffrey.
I agree. So Kyle, we're kind of coming up near the end. I think we'll turn it over to talk about professional learning communities and professional development.
So I think the idea here is that all of what we've kind of discussed, and you guys have had some great comments and some great chat going on, but it's all a process. You know, it's all about developing this culture within your classroom. This is not something that's going to just be like a switch that you can flip on. A lot of teachers that we work with think that after they go through some sort of training, that the next day they're going to walk into class and flip the switch and be able to apply it immediately, and that it's going to go off without a hitch. And especially with formative assessment, it really is a process that has to be developed. And in terms of kind of developing that culture with professional development, it has to kind of address a couple things. It has to address what teachers do in the classroom, and then it also has to assess how they're going to change what they do in the classroom. And that's the big thing, is that you can give teachers a lot of information and professional development on what they should do in the classroom, but a lot of times we leave the process of how we can help them change. We kind of leave that up to them and kind of say, all right, now go forth and conquer, without a lot of that support. So that seems to be a missing piece in a lot of the professional development, is helping them with the process of how they can change and incorporate more of the formative assessment type of ideas. Whenever possible, I mean, that should happen as close to the working environment as possible. You get a lot better transfer rate when you're transferring closer to their working environment, closer to their classroom environment, as opposed to when you just give a PD session in a workshop and tell them kind of go forth. And then the last thing, really, because we're getting short on time here, the last thing is there's a lot of different players involved with the formative assessment process. We've been kind of tackling it from the teacher perspective, but we can't forget that there's students involved too, and they need some training as well in terms of how to, as we talked about many times at the chat, how to handle mistakes and that growth mindset, and that really the idea of making mistakes in this formative assessment process is really what's helping them learn. And so we can't forget that students are part of this process as well, and we need to make sure that we're helping them, that we're teaching them, that we're giving them some development along the way. And definitely the idea that the peers, our peers are here to help as well. So, I mean, we have 80-something participants here tonight, and we're all chatting and helping each other with some ideas here. And that's a big part of it too. So anytime we can collaborate and help, whether it's just looking over questions, whether it's giving some feedback on whether this is a misconception and should be a distractor or not, all those types of things really are very helpful in a collaborative type of environment. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of something. In an hour-long webinar, we can't cover a lot of depth necessarily on all of this, but hopefully you get some ideas and can take some of those ideas back with you. So we'll turn it over to Mike now, and he's going to kind of finish things up for us.
Thanks so much, Kyle. As we do begin to wrap up tonight's event, if you have any last-minute questions for Kyle or Katie, please feel free to get those asked. I know they'll do their best to try and get some of those questions answered. I'm really excited that next week we have a webinar focusing on STEM, and we've done a lot of work with STEM Behind Health in the past. You might or might not be familiar with it, but there's a brand new activity coming out, and we're going to be releasing that activity next week. So if you're interested in how science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine can all come to your classroom in one, join us next week and check it out. This summer we are offering a lot of summer workshops, which we're really excited about, and those workshops are spread across the United States, focused in all different areas, whether it be content, technology, or pedagogy. And also at the beginning of the webinar on the agenda, we're going to be giving away, for one lucky winner, a free registration for a T-Cube summer workshop. And tonight's lucky winner is Barbara Dawson. So Barbara, congratulations. We'll be in touch over the coming days via email. But again, congratulations, and we hope everyone else is also going to be able to join us at a T-Cube summer workshop. Tonight's webinar, I saw probably more conversation than I think I've ever seen in the chat window. And so please feel free to continue that conversation on any of the major social media outlets. I'm glad you're excited. You guys had a lot of great thoughts and comments, and it was really exciting to see. So thanks so much for all of your information and comments, and we really appreciate it. To receive a certificate of attendance, go ahead and click that link in the chat window. Also listed is a link for the documents, which gives you the PowerPoint that we used tonight. In case you missed it, don't worry, you'll automatically get a follow-up email in a couple days. That will also have the same information as well as a link to the recording as well. I think we got most of your questions answered, but in case there's a couple of questions that weren't answered tonight, please feel free to reach out to us either via phone or email. Thanks so much, Kyle and Katie, again, for making us think a little bit about formative assessment. And again, it's clear that we have a lot of people that were joining us tonight that felt strongly about it. So it was really great to see, again, everyone's contributions to tonight's event. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Great chat tonight.
My pleasure. I had a great time talking to you all.
Thanks again, and we really hope to see you back online next week.